Hello and welcome to the program. In Russian-occupied Crimea, Crimean Tatar lawyer Emil Kurbedinov has been sentenced to 5 days in jail in Simferopol. He was detained earlier this week for a Facebook post he wrote 5 years ago, which has, quote, elements of extremism. Now, to discuss this and other human rights violations in the occupied peninsula, we'll welcome to the studio today Denis Savchenko. He's a deputy director of the NGO Crimea SOS. Hello and thank you for joining us. So first, First, let's focus on Kurbedinov. Why targeting him especially, and why now? What happened for this overview for the viewers to understand?
Emil Kurbedinov, together with Denis Savchenko and some other attorneys, were like the very first human rights activists who are on their own risk without any backup from the international NGOs or maybe national NGOs, and independent mass media started providing assistance to the victims of politically motivated persecution, both criminal and administrative. So they were definitely the target for the occupational, and a very huge problem for the occupational authorities starting from the very beginning of the temporary occupation of Crimea. And of course, here from Ukraine, we think that something new happened, that some changes were made in the situation in relations between the occupational authority and human rights activists. But if we listen to Emil Kurbedinov's colleagues, they would tell that the pressure was applied during all the time of their actions, and this detention, this arrest, is not the first for Emil Kurbedinov in particular.
Yeah, now, so the poor excuse of the Facebook post written 5 years ago, why is that happening now? Why using that kind of poor excuse to detain him?
There are many things happened recently into the territory of Crimea. First of all, we are talking about the detention of Ukrainian marine military personnel and the assistance that residents of Crimea in a very fast and in a very effective manner gathered and transferred to them into Moscow. This was a very disturbing signal for both the occupational authorities and for Kremlin, that despite all the propaganda, despite all the informational war, and despite all the efforts to somehow put all the signs of activism as forbidden, still there are too many people in Crimea that are very favorable towards Ukraine and that are willing to provide some assistance. So this action, the detention of Emil Kurbedinov, first of all, it was aimed at giving the signal to pro-Ukrainian population of Crimea: don't do anything, either way you will be the next.
So they're making him a symbol, as a Tatar.
Yes, definitely. The second of all, Emil Kurbedinov was one of the attorneys that were representing the Ukrainian military men, the Marines.
Okay.
So, and what was not described very well in this situation is that right before the arrest, the so-called representatives of the law enforcement authorities came to Emil Kurbedinov's office and took all of his equipment, including laptops and all the other stuff. So this action was aimed at disrupting his working activities, human rights activities. And the last thing, very important, is to somehow bring up a new information about Emil Kurbedinov. During the court hearing, the TV channel Kremlin 24, like the Department of Russia 24, yes, the federal TV channel that provides all this propaganda. So they got with, they made about 6 reports about Emil Kurbedinov and how bad he is, and about the fact that if he is involved in defending people accused of being the representatives of Hizb ut-Tahrir party,
yes.
forbidden in Russia, then he is the part of Hizb ut-Tahrir party, and if he defends people accused of terrorism, extremism, and all the other stuff, then he is terrorist, extremist, and all the others. So they try to somehow provide the negative image of Emil Kurbedinov and all the other Crimean Tatar and non-Crimean Tatar human rights defenders.
Which brings me to my next question. Kurbedinov is not the only one in this case. What's the situation? Can you sum up a little bit the situation now in Crimea towards human rights defenders and Crimean Tatar?
Well, the human rights defenders, the activists, are permanently under the pressure from the side of occupational authorities. The occupational authorities, they're not stopping at anything. They apply both these so-called legal remedies to put them under the pressure, but non-legal, illegal remedies too. For example, threatening and the things like that. In a line with Emil Kurbedinov, Adam Smedlayev and Lilia Gemidji, two other lawyers and Crimean Tatars and human rights activists, right before this event, they received the notification with the request to stop all the illegal activities. And the arrest of Emil Kurbedinov somehow is related to these notifications provided by so-called representatives of law enforcement authorities. So we can definitely say that this was a signal, a very negative signal, not only to Emil Kurbedinov, but to all the human rights activists. And of course, considering that no other remedies, no other instruments are effective, the occupational authority will try to continue the pressure on activists.
And that's where that's where the NGO Crimea SOS intervenes. What are the means of your NGOs here to, let's say, put pressure, or at least to change this course of event towards Russian authorities in Crimea?
Of course, we should confirm it that it is extremely hard to effectively and immediately influence the situation in Crimea, not staying there officially. What we try to do is to gather objective information about what is happening and transfer it both to representatives of Ukrainian government and representatives of international community. We try to encourage them to provide public statements about inappropriate manner that Russian Federation is acting in the territory of Crimea. For example, following the Emil Kurbedinov case, our NGO, together with other partner organizations, signed up the public statement and disseminated it among the very wide publicity. The other thing that we try to do is to provide support to Emil Kurbedinov personally by supporting his case in all the available manners, and
publicize it and advertise it at least the most possible in the possible.
Yes, of course, and to ensure himself that he is not forgotten. This is very valid for all the people being the hostages of Kremlin, being persecuted in Kremlin. They are in a very acute need to feel that they are not forgotten, and that some were people trying to make some contribution to make the difference in the situation.
Yeah, of course. Like we're thinking about Sentsov, we're thinking about like the other 70 more now with the Ukrainian sailors, more prisoners of the Kremlin. Now it seems to me that that's the first step. Could those reports that your Crimea SOS does, could it be the first step to file lawsuits against Russia in front of court, human rights, for example?
Definitely, and we have positive decisions of, for example, UN International Court on banning the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people. This decision made by the so-called Supreme Court of Crimea, of Republic of Crimea, was recognized as invalid and illegal. Unfortunately, Russian Federation stays deaf to such decisions and to such statements of international community. But what is very important in this relation is that all the official statements, all the official decisions of international entities, including courts and quasi-courts, they are used as the evidences, as the arguments to provide the prospect sanctions against Russian Federation. And this is what we are working on. So yeah, there are two dimensions. First of all, the individual dimension when we are trying to file complaints against Russian Federation in their actions against particular person, like human rights violation victim. But then there is this collective level,
like long-term prospect of
yes, and we try to somehow make Russian Federation as the state responsible for its illegal actions on the territory of Crimea, the so-called collective human rights violations.
Now, and to conclude this interview, are there any protests or events organized, or even charity events organized by your and scheduled by your organization soon to come?
Definitely, we are conducting a very active informational campaign to describe this situation in an appropriate and objective manner. We have monthly rallies at the embassy, near the embassy of Russian Federation in Kyiv, where all the interested persons are welcomed to participate. And definitely they are conducted like at the end of the month, 24th, 27th of each month. And this month we will definitely talk not only about the whole year, what was going on in Crimea during the year, but we will definitely talk about Emil Kurbedinov and the situation with him. The other thing that is scheduled is, of course, communication with all the interested parties to come up with some global public statement on what is happening.
Well, thank you for coming to our studio for this reminder. It was a pleasure to welcome you. That was Denis Savchenko. He's the Deputy Director of the NGO Crimea SOS. Thank you for watching the program and stay tuned for the rest.